So I'm going to talk about the beginning of ecological forecasting that we undertook in Chesapeake Bay about 10 years ago. What we did is we developed an annual communication strategy, which included the forecasting that we would do every spring, and then in the summer we would track the current conditions. In the summer, at the end of the summer, we would have a look back and see how well we did on the forecast. And then over the winter, we would assemble the various data into a report card, an annual integrated health assessment. We decided this way. We have a continual assessment reporting. We defined our target audience as the interested public. We used each of those reporting efforts to build context for understanding the conditions, and we always founded it on defensible science. One of the bigger reasons we did this was the forecasting was stimulated from the Bay program that kept getting beat up in the summer when the dead zone reports were coming in, and they would be caught kind of on their back foot, and so they wanted to get ahead of it and say, well, yeah, we knew this was going to be bad because of the conditions. So our goal was to develop good ecological forecasts of summer conditions for a variety of key indicators, and by doing this repeatedly, develop an improved forecasting capacity, effectively communicate the forecast and the associated uncertainties to the broader community, provide context for understanding these summer conditions, and provide guidance for the restoration effort, establish a proactive communication education program. And what we defined as the ecological forecast was kind of like a weather condition that's predicting conditions into the future, but much more than just weather. It was predicting effects of biological, chemical, physical, and human-induced changes on the ecosystem. Couldn't be a perfect guarantee, but we could provide scientifically sound estimations of what's likely to occur. Like percent probability of rainfall, we would give it a probability rather than an exact prediction. So our first effort in summer of 2005 were to forecast these three things: dissolved oxygen, in particular the hypoxia and anoxia zone, in deep water when we had lots of runoff, lots of nutrients, a lot of phytoplankton that would rain down into the bottom water, and it was stratified because of the warmer fresh water over the colder, saltier water, and then the oxygen consumption by bacteria of those phytoplankton reducing the oxygen. And then in microcystis blooms in the Potomac River, the cyanobacteria that would carpet the surface of the river, bright green, and cause fish kills, typically toxic. And then finally the submerged aquatic vegetation, which are influenced by nutrients as well as salinity and turbidity. So we forecasted that based on different salinity regimes, the freshwater versus the mid-salinity versus the high salinity grasses. So first of all, the dissolved oxygen. We started our premise from the Hagee et al. Paper in 2004, in which they correlated a predicted hypoxic volume versus an observed hypoxic volume based on, very simply, the Susquehanna River flow times the concentration of total nitrogen. So it's basically nitrogen loading from the Susquehanna. And you can see a fairly robust correlation there. And these predictions were hindcast. They weren't predicted ahead of time. This was looking back at the data. So we thought, well, we could be able to do that for a true forecast. So we used the Susquehanna River, plus we added the northern inputs of nitrogen as well. And we used that to forecast the main stem anoxic volume. And so that spring load, that nutrient load index was developed from the Susquehanna, which was that pink watershed there, half of the watershed of Chesapeake Bay and half of the freshwater flow approximately. And you can see in spring 2005, based on the spring flow, we predicted an anoxic volume somewhat analogous to the 1998 volume, and that would be the map on the left. So that's what we forecast. What did we measure? Well, we measured a much more extreme anoxic volume than our forecast is, as we'll talk about in a minute. So that was our forecast there, which is going to be the fourth worst ever recorded, 1.7 cubic kilometers, similar to 1998. In reality, the observed was the worst, highest ever recorded. So we got the sort of the concept out there was going to be a bad year. We had no idea it was going to be the worst year. Why did we make that? Why didn't we get it right? Well, we didn't account for the summer conditions. So what happened in the summer of 2005 was it was really warm and very still. So we had reduced winds. We went and found the wind data from Thomas Point Light. We used the main stem water temperatures, and you can see it was record high temperatures. So those warm, still days were served to enhance the hypoxia and anoxia in 2005 and led to a very high anoxia volume. And we'll talk in a minute about the ramifications for seagrass. So we also tried for the Potomac River Microcystis blooms that are in the upper reaches of the estuary, and this was a really big problem in the 60s, so they started to develop a monitoring program to track this, and we had some bloom intensities as in terms of cell densities really ramping up in the early 2000s. These are some photos of that bloom just to give you the idea of the magnitude, both the scale and the intensity of the bloom. And what we developed for a forecasting tool is relating it to two flows, the spring flow from the year of, and then the previous year's flow. And so the previous year's flow we saw was setting it up and influencing initiation, and the spring flow, the magnitude of it. And I'll go through those in a minute. Here's a map of the 2004 blooms. You can see the bubble diagram where they're usually Mattawoman Creek was sort of the epicenter, but in this case it was a little south of Mattawoman Creek. And you can see from the satellite as well the intensity of those blooms and the widespread across the entire river. So we said for the previous year that would influence the onset of the bloom and the duration, and then the spring flow would control how extended the bloom was, how many miles, river miles that would encompass. So when we did that based on those crude forecasting tools, we forecast late spring and early summer, and in fact we did indeed see an early summer, July 11th as the onset. We also forecast a extended, at least a couple months. Didn't really end up that. It was only a month and a half. And the moderate bloom size of 10 to 20 miles was on the edge. So we kind of got it right in terms of the harmful algal blooms. Now, in terms of bay grasses, we were looking at turbidity and salinity as the major drivers. We'd been seeing that freshwater flow had a dramatic effect on the grass abundance. You can see 2003 we had a very, very wet year, the graph on the right, and then as a result of a major reduction of grass, 30% reduction as a result of those big flows. We also divided the grasses up into three groupings: the freshwater mixed species assemblage, the mesohaline, dominated by rupia or widgeon grass, and the polyhaline, high salinity, dominated by eelgrass or zostra. And the map there shows both in the main stem, the freshwater, meso, and polyhaline, but as well up the tributaries, a similar pattern. And what we found was that there was an amazing uptick of grasses up in the freshwater reaches, and this is the Susquehanna Flats, the beginning of what became a well-documented expansion in the Susquehanna Flats. We forecast an overall increase in the freshwater. We didn't forecast a decrease in the high salinity area, and that was largely due to that hot, still set of conditions that ended up dramatically reducing the zostra in 2005, and that burnout was also observed in 2010 as well. So it's not that easy, and so I picked up a few quotes about forecasting that kind of get that message across. Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. Said Nobel laureate Niels Bohr. Someone said a good forecaster is not smarter than everyone else. He merely has his ignorance better organized. Churchill, always good for quotes, said, I always avoid prophesizing beforehand because it's much better to prophesize after the event has already taken place. Mark Twain said, prophecy is a good line of business, but it's full of risk. A French guy, Poincaré, said it's far better to foresee even without certainty than to not foresee at all. And then Voltaire said it's said that the present is pregnant with the future. So a lot of people have thought a lot long and hard about forecasting. It's not an easy business, and we found out, in fact, beginning in 2005, how difficult that could be.